Welcome everyone to another installment of our step-by-step series here in Decisions. Today we're going to be taking a deeper look at the CSV to object mapping step. The CSV to object mapping step is going to allow you to take in a CSV, Excel, or Excel XLSX file and output that data into Decisions so that it can be either saved or utilized in your flows. You have step controls such as the CSV Delimiter. So even though the C in CSV stands for comma, we do have more options as you see down there on the bottom right. The other control that you're going to need to know is whether you should or should not ignore the first line of the CSV, which we'll take a look at here in its actual use case. A lot of the control within this step is going to come from the CSV to object mapping editor, which can be found in the top right-hand corner of the properties panel, where you're going to map in those fields or the columns within your CSV file and map them into the structure that you chose on the previous screen. So let's take a look at what it looks like in Decisions. So here in Decisions version 9, I have a project called CSV to object mapping with a couple flows built out to show some functionality of the CSV to object mapping step. The first thing I want to show is that I do have a data structure built out, a simple data structure called inbound footwear order. And this is going to be kind of a landing zone or a nest for that CSV to kind of be converted into. But I did create a structure right here. I do want to kind of show that prerequisite. So let's start out with the first flow I have here, CSV to object mapping basics. So essentially what CSV to object mapping is going to allow you to do is to take in a CSV file, and I made this in Excel and exported it as a CSV, and you might make the connection to that data structure I just referenced. It has all of these fields in it, and I mapped in that CSV file as just a constant input. You could have this come from a form, you could have this come from a number of other places, but for now, just to keep things basic, we had it mapped in as a constant. We were able to choose what type of output data we wanted. We chose a user-defined type, this inbound footwear order. We're also given the option to change the delimiter if it changes, but for this file, it is a comma delimiter. So, when I debug this, it's going to take the data from that CSV file and map it in so that it can be viewed as outputs of the flow. So you'll notice here, the CSV file comes in as raw data and comes out into that structure. So brand goes to brand, vendor number goes to vendor number, style, size, quantity, description, ship date, all of those things are mapped in so they can be referenced and utilized in Decisions. The most important part that most people tend to forget about with CSV to object mapping is that you do need to map those fields into the structure itself. And that can be done on the top right up here with the Show Item Mapping Editor. You'll notice that I have Ignore First Line checked. Why do I have that checked? Because the first line of our CSV is just the names of the structures or names of the fields. So I chose to ignore first line so that the first brand I have is not called brand, and the first quantity I have is not called quantity. It will actually error out if I try and save it like this and debug it, because some of those field members do not match, and it's probably because I have quantity set as an integer, and it's not going to let me map the word quantity into integer. So where is that item mapping editor? It is on the top right up here. So what it will allow you to do is it'll give you all of the fields as well as the structure that you chose for output data right here. So once I select that output data type, inbound footwear order, I can build data on it and see the fields beneath it. I can take a look at that CSV file and say, hey, I know, column number 1 is the brand, 2, vendor, so on and so forth. Another important thing to understand is that if you are utilizing things outside of strings, such as date times, integers, you may need to parse through some of this. So let's say for ship date, right? You may need to parse down and take the actual date time value out rather than the cell value, depending on what type of structure you have. So that might be true for size as well. That might be true for any of those that have something outside of a string. So if you choose to map in outside of a string, like a date time, a decimal, an integer, things along those lines, or a Boolean value. You might need to kind of expand this cell value and check whether it's a Boolean, it's a date, it's a number, things along those lines. But this is where we're going to get that mapping in so that we know that column 1 equals brand, so on and so forth. So if you are mapping into the CSV to object mapping editor and you keep getting null values or an error, it's probably because you forgot to come on up here and change what fields go into what fields, because it's not going to know automatically. So again, as we kind of go through here, we can kind of click and say, okay, field 5, we took the number value as a decimal into quantity. So essentially, again, kind of a basic overview. I can take in this CSV file that I made and map it in to decisions so that I can mess with that data. All right, let's take a moment to look at a deeper look at this in some extended functionality. So you have CSV to object mapping set up. An important thing to understand is that that is not going to by default save any of that data into decisions for you to reference later. That data will just be active as the flow is running. If you want to save that data into decisions or somewhere else, you'll need to use a step to save it, because again, that data does not have permanence. It's just there while the flow is running. We have an easy option here for you. It depends on what type of data structure you have. You can use a setup process folder and store it with headers and names of folders, but we chose to just go with save entities to keep things simple. So I have the exact same setup, the exact same CSV file for demo, and I just chose to go to save entities, what type, the inbound footwear order, save multiple entities, which gives me the list option, and I can just take the outputs of this to save it into a report. So if I run this flow and then I go to look at a report for it, it will have that data now living in decisions so that you can fetch it in other flows and things along those lines. But you'll need to use something like a save entities or something like that to save it into decisions. Again, you can use a setup process folder. You can save it as a case. There's a number of options depending on what type of structure and what your use case is. But it's important to understand that data is not going to be saved just because you did CSV to object mapping. You're going to need to save it in decisions using another step. And you have the flexibility to save it in the way that you want to. The last thing we're going to take a look at is just some kind of extended options. And if you've ever worked in flows before, I'm not going to show you anything that you haven't already seen, but I do think it's important to kind of just say like, hey, you do have more options. If I wanted to, I could put a save entities on this end. I could have a form on the front where I have people dynamically populate that CSV day to day, week to week, month to month, whatever really applies to your business use case. But what I can do is something along these lines. If I go to debug, I can place a form to filter, and it runs this rule collection filter. We have another step-by-step video on the rule collection filter, and I can change this to say, hey, I only want access to data that is going to have a quantity greater than 7 with a ship date after, let's say, tomorrow. And what that will allow us to do is on the output of this rule collection filter, I'm taking in all this data, so I do still have access to it. I'm taking in the total CSV, but I'm only outputting a singular item because this is the only item that has more than 7 in quantity and also ships after today. This ID is null because I'm not saving into decisions. Once I do decide to save it using save entities, this will be populated by your decisions instance. So that data goes through there. I set up that rule just using exposed flow data, and then I mapped in entity quantity greater than or equal to the output of the form, and the entity ship date greater than the ship date. And this entity is kind of the prefix for anything that goes into the rule collection filter. And again, we do have a video on that as well. So that is just a quick look at the CSV to object mapping editor. It's going to allow you to take in CSV files and manipulate that data in decisions in a real linear and smooth process. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to training@decisions.com or support@decisions.com. Thank you very much. Have a good day.